My name is Anna. I'm 32, and I'm here because I need help figuring out if I've completely lost perspective on this mess. Growing up, my family always had a favorite, and it wasn't me. My sister, Lisa, was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. It didn't matter what she did. If she broke curfew, skipped school, or even got caught lying, she'd get a shrug or a laugh. Kids will be kids, my mom would say, while I stood in the background, quietly seething. Me? I was the one expected to follow the rules, the one always compared to Lisa. Why can't you be more like your sister? That sentence haunted my childhood. It didn't matter that I was the one getting straight A's or helping out around the house. I wasn't Lisa, and that was enough. Those dynamics didn't just fade away when we grew up. Lisa seemed to float through life, making impulsive decisions and always landing on her feet, thanks to my parents swooping in to save her. Meanwhile, I learned early on that if I wanted anything, I'd have to work for it. And I did. I worked hard for everything I have. Fast forward to now, and things haven't really changed. Lisa's married with 3 kids. I'm single and just bought my first house, a huge milestone for me after years of saving and working 2 jobs. But Lisa? She's still Lisa, and somehow, her latest crisis has dragged me right back into the middle of it. I wish I could say I'm surprised, but honestly, I've always known that when things fall apart for Lisa, it's only a matter of time before the rest of us are expected to pick up the pieces. When I think back to our childhood, it feels like my entire life revolved around Lisa's orbit. She wasn't just the favorite. She was the sun, and everything else, including me, revolved around her. My parents adored her. Every time she messed up, it was excused. Every time I excelled, it was overlooked. It wasn't even subtle. I remember one summer when Lisa failed her math class and had to go to summer school. My parents bent over backward to make sure she felt supported. They bought her a new backpack, gave her pep talks, and even promised her a trip to Disneyland if she improved her grades. Me? I was at home, quietly proud of the fact that I'd aced all my classes, but no one noticed. Instead, my mom said, "You should help Lisa with her homework. You're so good at this stuff." And it wasn't just academics. Lisa was the social butterfly, the pretty one, the free spirit. She had a way of charming people, even when she was clearly in the wrong. I'll never forget the time she crashed my dad's car as a teenager. She didn't even have her license yet. I thought she'd finally face some real consequences. Instead, my parents laughed it off. "It's just a car," my dad said. "At least she's okay." I think that was the moment I realized the rules were different for her. Lisa could walk through life without a care in the world, while I was expected to pick up the slack. If Lisa was late to a family dinner, I was scolded for not reminding her. If she forgot to do her chores, I was the one who had to step in. It wasn't jealousy. It was exhaustion. Growing up in Lisa's shadow meant I learned early on that fairness wasn't something I could count on in our family. I had to be twice as responsible, twice as careful, because no one was coming to save me. And I couldn't help but resent her for it. Despite everything, I always believed in hard work. It wasn't easy, but I knew that if I wanted to create a life for myself, I had to rely on my own effort. That's exactly what I did. For years, I worked 2 jobs, sacrificing vacations, nights out, and any semblance of a social life. Every penny I earned went toward my dream of owning a home, a place that would truly be mine. Last month, after years of saving and countless late nights, I finally did it. I bought my first house. It's not a mansion or anything fancy. It's just a modest little place, but it's mine. Every corner of it represents years of hard work and determination. I can still remember the moment I got the keys. I walked through the front door and just stood there, feeling a mix of pride, relief, and disbelief. For once, I'd achieved something entirely on my own. The house isn't perfect. Half the rooms are still empty because I haven't had time or money to furnish them. My belongings are scattered in boxes, and my dining table is currently just a fold-out card table. But none of that matters. What matters is that I've finally built a space where I can breathe, where I can feel in control of my own life. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to relax, to imagine a future where I wasn't constantly scrambling to prove myself. I finally had a sense of stability, something I've been chasing my entire life. But that sense of peace, it didn't last long. Because when Lisa's life fell apart, again, it was my hard-won little house that everyone expected to become the solution. Lisa has always been unpredictable, but even I didn't see this coming. A few weeks ago, she left. Just packed a bag and walked out on her husband, Jason, and their 3 kids. No warning, no explanation, just gone. Lisa and Jason had been having issues for a while. That much was obvious. But to leave not just him, but also her kids, that was a new low, even for her. Jason was left completely blindsided. He works long hours to provide for the family. And now, suddenly, he was juggling work, childcare, and the fallout from Lisa's disappearance. I can't imagine what those kids must have felt. An 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 4-year-old, all wondering where their mom went. Jason tried to hold everything together, but it was clear he was drowning. My mom stepped in to help, offering to take the kids for a few days at a time. But with her health and energy not being what it used to be, it quickly became too much for her. The kids started bouncing between relatives, Jason's cousin, our mom, a neighbor here and there, anyone who could lend a hand. It was chaos. And all the while, Lisa was nowhere to be found. Or at least that's what she wanted us to think. Turns out Lisa wasn't exactly hiding. She was posting Instagram pictures from what looked like a tropical vacation. Cocktails on the beach, spa treatments, fancy dinners, all while her husband and kids were left scrambling to figure out their lives. When I saw those photos, I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Here was Lisa, living her best life, while the rest of us were left to pick up the pieces of her mess. It was infuriating. But of course, in true Lisa fashion, she wasn't answering calls or texts, so we couldn't even confront her about it. That's when my phone rang, and my mom's name flashed on the screen. I should have known nothing good was about to come from that conversation. Jason has always seemed like a decent guy, the kind of person who works hard and tries to do the right thing. But no one could have prepared him for this. He was suddenly a single parent to 3 young kids, all while trying to hold down a demanding job. Every time I spoke to him, he sounded more exhausted, more defeated. He's a mechanic and works long hours at the shop. Hours that don't exactly line up with daycare schedules or bedtime routines. He'd get up before dawn, drop the kids off wherever he could find someone to watch them, and then work a full day before coming home to cook, clean, and do it all over again. And this wasn't sustainable. The kids were clearly feeling the strain. From what I heard, they were acting out. Temper tantrums, refusing to eat, the older one having trouble in school. It's not their fault. They're just kids who don't understand why their mom isn't around anymore. But for Jason, it was one more thing on an already impossible plate. He tried asking Lisa's side of the family for help, but most of them either didn't have the capacity or just didn't want to get involved. It wasn't long before my mom became the go-to solution. She loves her grandkids, but she's not young anymore. Taking care of 3 energetic kids was more than she could handle, and she quickly became overwhelmed. It felt like the whole situation was spiraling. And yet, Lisa? She was still off the grid, living like she didn't have a care in the world. It was Jason, the kids, and the rest of us left to pick up the pieces. Then came the moment I dreaded. My mom called, and this time, she had a solution in mind, one that involved me. When my mom called, I could hear the weariness in her voice. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Anna," she said, "we need to talk." That's never a good sign. She launched into the same story I'd already heard a dozen times, how Jason was struggling, how the kids needed stability, how Lisa wasn't answering her phone. None of this was news to me, but I let her speak. Then came the part I wasn't expecting. "You have the space now," she said. "Why don't you let the kids stay with you for a while, just until Lisa gets her act together?" I was floored. I barely had time to process what she was asking before she kept going, listing all the reasons why this made sense. My new house had extra rooms. I didn't have kids of my own. I wasn't married, so there wouldn't be anyone else to consider. At first, I didn't know how to respond. I just sat there, stunned, as she kept talking. When I finally found my voice, all I could say was, "Mom, I just moved in. I don't even have furniture in half the rooms yet. How am I supposed to take care of 3 kids? That's when the guilt tripping started. She said the kids needed stability, that they were family, and family takes care of each other. Then she dropped the line that really hit a nerve. You don't have kids, so it's not like you have anything else to focus on. I snapped. I couldn't help it. All the years of being told to pick up after Lisa, to be the responsible one while she got a free pass, it all boiled over. Lisa is the selfish one, not me, I shouted. She's the one who walked out on her kids. Why should I have to clean up her mess? The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then quietly, my mom said, I just thought you'd want to help. Before I could respond, she started crying, and the conversation ended as abruptly as it began. But the fallout was only just beginning. After that phone call, I couldn't stop replaying my mom's words in my head. You don't have kids, so it's not like you have anything else to focus on. That sentence burrowed into my brain and refused to leave. It wasn't just hurtful, it was dismissive. To her, the fact that I'd worked for years to build my life didn't seem to matter. The long hours, the sacrifices, the grind to finally buy a home, it was all brushed aside as irrelevant because I didn't have kids. My accomplishments, my struggles, my plans, they were nothing compared to Lisa's needs. Yet again, the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about me saying no to taking in Lisa's kids. This was about a lifetime of being treated like my life didn't hold the same value as hers. It was about all the times I'd been asked to put her first, to step in when she failed, to make sacrifices so she wouldn't have to. But this time felt different. This wasn't about doing her homework or covering for her when she was late. This was about 3 kids who deserved better than to be tossed around like afterthoughts because their mother decided to bail. And yet, I knew I couldn't be their solution. I didn't have the resources, the experience, or the mental capacity to suddenly become a caretaker for 3 small children. But that didn't seem to matter to my mom. To her, this wasn't about fairness or what was right. It was about convenience. I knew the family wouldn't take my side. They never did when it came to Lisa. But for the first time, I wasn't just angry. I was done. Done being the backup plan for everyone else's bad decisions. The guilt started almost immediately after that phone call. It wasn't because I thought I'd done something wrong. Deep down, I knew I was justified. But the way my mom's voice broke when she said, I just thought you'd want to help, haunted me. It felt like I had let her down, like I was abandoning her and the kids in the same way Lisa had. But that guilt was quickly drowned out by anger. Why was this my problem? Why was I the one expected to drop everything and take on a responsibility that wasn't mine? Lisa made this mess, not me. And yet, as always, I was the one being called to fix it. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls and messages from family. News of the argument with my mom spread quickly, and everyone seemed to have an opinion. Some were on my side, saying it wasn't fair to ask me to take in the kids, especially since Lisa hadn't even bothered to reach out. Others, though, weren't so kind. Anna, they're just kids, one aunt said. You have a house now. It's selfish to say no. She's your sister, another cousin added. What kind of example are you setting by refusing to help her kids? But the one that hurt the most came from my uncle, who I'd always thought understood me. You don't have children, Anna. You don't understand what it's like. This isn't about Lisa. It's about those kids and what they need. The weight of it all was unbearable. Every accusation felt like a dagger, a reminder of how little my family understood me or my boundaries. They saw a house, a person with no children, and decided I was the obvious choice to step in. But they didn't see the years of effort it took to get here or the toll this would take on my life. It felt like I was screaming into a void, trying to make them understand something they had no interest in hearing. And that's when I realized I wasn't just fighting my family. I was fighting years of a system that had always put Lisa first and left me in her shadow. It didn't take long for the family to split into 2 camps, those who thought I was right and those who thought I was heartless. The phone calls and texts came in daily, each one adding fuel to the fire. On one side, I had a few relatives who actually understood where I was coming from. My cousin Sarah, who has kids of her own, was the first to say what I desperately needed to hear. Anna, this isn't your responsibility. You didn't walk out on those kids, Lisa did. It's unfair to expect you to just step in like this. My dad, surprisingly, also seemed to be in my corner. He told me, "You've worked hard for everything you have. You don't owe anyone your peace, not even family." Hearing that from him meant more than I expected, but it didn't make the backlash any easier. The other side of the family was far louder. My mom was leading the charge, calling me selfish and ungrateful. She couldn't understand how I could turn my back on my own nieces and nephew. My aunts joined in, some using guilt, others just outright attacking me. "Family helps family," one of them said. "It's disgusting that you'd even hesitate." Every conversation left me feeling drained and more isolated. It wasn't just about the kids anymore. It was about my role in the family, about what they expected from me and why. No one was asking Lisa to step up. No one was even questioning her actions. All the pressure fell on me, as if I was the only person capable of fixing this mess. It was exhausting. I wanted to scream, to remind them that Lisa wasn't a victim, but it felt pointless. My family had always been this way, and deep down, I knew they'd never change. While the family was busy debating whether I was selfish or just plain heartless, Lisa was nowhere to be found. Not a single call, text, or even a vague attempt to check in on her kids. It was like she had vanished completely, at least to the people who were trying to reach her. But Lisa wasn't exactly in hiding. She was very visible to anyone following her on Instagram. Every day, like clockwork, she posted pictures that made it clear she was having the time of her life. Cocktails on the beach, sunset boat rides, spa treatments. It was all there in perfect filtered detail. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself not to look, not to let it get to me. But the curiosity got the better of me. And once I saw those pictures, I couldn't unsee them. There she was, smiling as if she didn't have a care in the world, while her husband was at home trying to keep 3 young kids fed, bathed, and sane. The sheer audacity of it all was overwhelming. She wasn't just neglecting her responsibilities, she was flaunting it. Almost like she wanted everyone to know she didn't feel guilty. And the worst part? No one else in the family seemed to care. When I brought it up during a heated phone call with my mom, she brushed it off. "Lisa just needs time to figure things out," she said, as if abandoning her family and playing tourist in paradise were completely reasonable ways to figure things out. That conversation cemented something I'd already suspected. The family wasn't going to hold Lisa accountable. They never had, and they weren't about to start now. Instead, they were doubling down on making this my problem. It was infuriating. While I was being painted as the villain for refusing to step in, Lisa was living her best life without a single consequence. And the kids? They were left to wonder why their mom had disappeared, while the rest of us scrambled to fill the void she left behind. No matter how justified I felt in my decision, the guilt gnawed at me. It wasn't because I thought I was wrong, but because I couldn't stop thinking about the kids. They didn't ask for this. They didn't ask to have a mother who would walk away without a second thought. And yet, they were the ones paying the highest price for Lisa's choices. I kept picturing their faces. The oldest, probably trying to act strong and hold it together for her brothers. The middle one, confused and scared but too young to put it into words. And the youngest, likely asking over and over where their mom had gone. The thought of them feeling abandoned tore me up inside. But then reality would hit me. I wasn't equipped to take care of 3 kids. I didn't have the space, literal or emotional, to handle that kind of responsibility. I had worked so hard to create a life for myself, to finally have some stability, and now everyone was asking me to throw that away. Every time I thought about saying yes, I felt the weight of what it would mean. My life would be consumed by school pickups, tantrums, homework, meals, and everything else that comes with being a caretaker. And for what? To let Lisa continue living in her fantasy world while I cleaned up the mess she left behind? The guilt didn't go away, but neither did the anger. I couldn't help but resent the position I'd been put in, forced to choose between my own well-being and the happiness of 3 innocent kids. No matter which way I looked at it, The situation was a lose-lose. And the person who should have been bearing this burden? She was sipping cocktails on a beach. The hardest part of all this wasn't the anger at Lisa or the frustration with my family. It was the kids. They didn't deserve any of this, and I knew it. They were just 3 little lives caught in the middle of a storm they had no part in creating. I kept thinking about what their days must look like. Waking up in a different house every week, never knowing who would be there to tuck them in at night. Their mom wasn't around, and their dad, as much as he was trying, was stretched far too thin. It wasn't fair. And then there were the questions they must have been asking. When is mom coming back? Why can't we stay in one place? How do you explain to a child that their mother chose to leave? How do you convince them it's not their fault, even when they can't help but wonder if it is? Every time I pictured their faces, I felt the weight of it pressing down on me. These weren't just theoretical kids. They were my niece and nephews. I remembered their birthdays, their giggles, the times I'd visited and played silly games with them. They weren't strangers. They were family. But as much as I cared about them, I couldn't shake the voice in my head telling me I wasn't the answer to their problems. I wasn't their mom. I wasn't ready to be anyone's mom. Taking them in might give them a roof over their heads, but it wouldn't fix the deeper wound Lisa had left. And it would tear apart the life I'd worked so hard to build. I hated how cold that sounded, even to myself. But it wasn't about being heartless. It was about being realistic. I wanted to help, but not at the cost of my own sanity and stability. Still, that didn't make the decision any easier. Every time I said no in my head, it felt like I was failing them. And that guilt? It didn't let up for a second. The more I thought about Lisa's behavior, the angrier I became. She wasn't just irresponsible. She was unapologetically selfish. What infuriated me most was the blatant hypocrisy of it all. Lisa had always lived her life on her terms, with the family bending over backward to clean up after her. And now, when her choices had real consequences, she had the audacity to check out completely. Lisa's entire life had been a series of get-out-of-jail-free cards. Failed classes? My parents got her a tutor and rewarded her for passing. Bad boyfriends? They were just phases. When she decided to drop out of college, my mom defended her, saying, "Lisa just needs time to figure out what she wants." Time. That was always the excuse. Lisa always needed more time. And here we were, years later, with the same excuse being trotted out for her. This wasn't a mistake or a misstep. She had walked out on her kids, left Jason scrambling, and dumped the fallout on the rest of us. But instead of holding her accountable, my mom and others in the family were more focused on making sure her kids were taken care of. By someone else, of course. Meanwhile, Lisa was living it up. Those Instagram posts weren't just tone-deaf. They were a slap in the face to everyone trying to manage the disaster she left behind. While we were juggling real problems, she was flaunting her freedom, making it clear she didn't care about the chaos in her wake. And yet, the family wasn't mad at her. No one was calling Lisa selfish. No one was demanding she come back and deal with the mess she created. Instead, I was the one being labeled cold and ungrateful. The double standard was staggering, and I was done playing along. If there's one thing my family is good at, it's applying pressure. After the phone call with my mom, it seemed like the entire extended family had something to say about my decision. The guilt-tripping and judgment came in waves, each conversation feeling heavier than the last. My mom was relentless. Every call started the same way. "Anna, have you thought about it more? The kids need you." If I said no, she'd sigh deeply, as if I were personally letting her down. Then she'd hit me with the emotional 1-2 punch. "You've always been so responsible. I thought you'd understand how much they need stability right now." It wasn't just her, though. Aunts, uncles, cousins, they all had their opinions. "Anna, they're just kids," one of my aunts said during a family dinner. "Imagine how scared they must feel right now. Don't you think you could make this easier for them?" Others didn't bother sugarcoating it. "This isn't about you," my uncle snapped during a phone call. "It's about doing what's right for the family. You've always been selfish, Anna, but I never thought you'd take it this far." Selfish. That word kept coming up over and over. To them, I wasn't just refusing to help. I was betraying the family, and no one was shy about letting me know. The worst part was that no one seemed to care about my side of things. I tried explaining that I wasn't in a position to take on 3 kids, that I didn't have the resources or the experience. But every time, I was met with some variation of, "You'll figure it out. You're capable." It was infuriating. My family wasn't asking me. They were expecting me to put my life on hold, to sacrifice everything I'd worked for because Lisa couldn't be bothered. And the more they pushed, the more I felt like I was suffocating. I wasn't just fighting to defend my decision. I was fighting to keep my sense of self intact. And I was losing. As the family continued to pile on the guilt, I realized something important. No one actually cared about my perspective. It didn't matter how much I tried to explain myself, how many times I said I wasn't ready to take on 3 kids, or how much effort it had taken for me to get where I was. To them, my reasons were just excuses. But here's the thing. This wasn't just about the kids. It was about boundaries. Boundaries I'd never been allowed to have growing up. Lisa always came first, and I was expected to be the backup plan. Now, as an adult, it felt like nothing had changed. The truth is, I worked hard for my house. I spent years sacrificing time, energy, and a social life to save up enough money. And for once, I felt like I had something that was truly mine. But instead of celebrating with me, my family saw it as an opportunity to take advantage of my stability. It wasn't that I didn't care about my niece and nephews. I did. But I also knew my limits. Taking them in wouldn't just be an adjustment. It would be a complete upheaval of my life. I'd go from having my first taste of independence to being a full-time caretaker overnight. I tried to explain this to my mom, to my aunts, to anyone who would listen. "I'm not the solution," I said, over and over again. "Lisa should be here. She should be the one fixing this, not me." But no one wanted to hear it. They just kept telling me to step up, to sacrifice, to be the bigger person. It felt like I was shouting into the void, desperately trying to make them understand. But in their eyes, I wasn't a person with boundaries. I was a resource, and they were determined to use me. In the middle of all the chaos, one question kept popping into my mind. What about Jason? He's their dad, after all. If anyone should be stepping up for those kids, it's him. But the family wasn't focusing on Jason. All the pressure was on me. I get it. Jason's in a tough spot. Lisa left him high and dry, and now he's working long hours just to keep the household afloat. He's exhausted, overwhelmed, and probably just as lost as the kids are. I sympathized with him. I really did. But that didn't mean I could become the safety net for his family. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how unfair the situation was. Jason wasn't reaching out to me directly, asking for help. It was my mom and other relatives doing all the talking, as if they'd decided amongst themselves that I was the best solution. I wondered if Jason even knew they were asking me to take in the kids. And then there's Lisa. She's their mom, and while Jason is running himself into the ground, trying to keep things together, she's posting vacation photos. Not once has she called or checked in, let alone offered to come back and take responsibility. And yet, no one seemed to be holding her accountable. It felt like the family was using Jason's struggle as a reason to guilt me. "He's doing the best he can," they'd say. "You could make things easier for him." And sure, I could have, but at what cost? Helping Jason meant sacrificing my own stability and peace of mind. Meanwhile, Lisa, the person who caused all this, was off living her carefree life. Jason didn't deserve to be in this position, but neither did I. I had every right to protect the life I'd worked so hard to build. And yet, the family kept acting like it was my duty to swoop in and save the day. As if Jason and Lisa's choices had somehow become my responsibility. If there's one person who's been central to this entire mess, it's my mom. From the moment Lisa left, she became the de facto leader of Operation Fix Lisa's Mistake. She organized where the kids would go, coordinated with Jason, and of course decided that I was the perfect candidate to step in. But this isn't new behavior. My mom has always been Lisa's biggest defender. Growing up, no matter how badly Lisa messed up, my mom was right there to excuse it. cover for her, or smooth things over. "Lisa just needs time," she'd say. Or, "Lisa's figuring things out." Meanwhile, I was held to a completely different standard. This situation was no different. My mom wasn't angry at Lisa for leaving. She wasn't demanding that Lisa come back, or even acknowledging how deeply Lisa had failed her kids. Instead, she was redirecting all of that responsibility onto me. It was like my mom couldn't see Lisa for who she really was. In her eyes, Lisa was still the golden child, the one who just needed a little more time and understanding. And because of that, the rest of us were expected to clean up her messes. What frustrated me most was how little my mom seemed to care about what this was doing to me. Every time I tried to explain why I couldn't take in the kids, she'd brush it off. "You're strong, Anna," she'd say. "You'll figure it out." It was as if my feelings, my boundaries didn't matter at all. I wasn't angry at her for wanting to help the kids. I understood that. But I couldn't forgive the way she was so quick to sacrifice me to protect Lisa from the consequences of her own choices. Once again, I was the backup plan, and I was tired of it. One thing no one seemed to consider was the financial reality of taking in 3 kids. It wasn't just a matter of giving them a place to stay, it was about everything that came with it. Food, clothing, school supplies, doctor visits, and the endless other expenses that come with raising children. I'm not exactly rolling in money. I'd just spent nearly all of my savings on the down payment for my house, not to mention the furniture and other basics I still needed. My monthly budget was tight, and every dollar was accounted for. How was I supposed to suddenly afford to care for 3 additional people, let alone 3 growing kids? Even if my family didn't seem to care about my emotional readiness, I thought the financial aspect would make them see reason. I tried bringing it up during one of my many conversations with my mom. "Who's going to pay for their school lunches?" I asked. "Or their clothes when they outgrow what they have? Or their medical bills if one of them gets sick?" Her response floored me. "They're kids, Anna. They don't need much. You'll make it work." Make it work? That was easy for her to say. She wasn't the one being asked to shoulder the cost of raising 3 children. And what if something unexpected came up? What if I couldn't make it work? None of that seemed to matter to her. The financial stress wasn't just theoretical. I'd run the numbers in my head a dozen times, and no matter how I spun it, I couldn't afford to take them in without sacrificing the stability I'd worked so hard to achieve. And yet, no one wanted to hear it. To my family, my financial concerns weren't valid. They were excuses. They saw me as someone with a house and no dependents, which in their minds meant I was flush with money and free time. But that wasn't my reality. I was barely getting started on building my life, and taking in Lisa's kids would mean throwing everything I'd worked for out the window. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about Lisa or even the kids. It was about my space, something I had fought tooth and nail to create for myself. For the first time in my life, I had a place that was entirely mine, where I could breathe and finally feel in control. And now, that space was being treated like a solution to someone else's problem. I worked so hard to get here. The house may not be perfect. It's small, half the rooms are still empty, and I'm living off a pretty tight budget, but it's mine. Every wall, every corner represents years of sacrifices and determination. It's my sanctuary. And the idea of that being taken away so quickly felt devastating. I wasn't just saying no to the kids because of the practical challenges. I was saying no because my home is my boundary. It's the one place where I don't have to answer to anyone, where I can make decisions based on what's best for me. Taking in 3 kids, as much as I care about them, would shatter that. It wasn't just about losing physical space. It was about losing emotional space, too. I'd spent so long being the dependable one, the one who stepped in whenever Lisa fell short. My house was supposed to be the first thing in my life that was just for me. It wasn't selfish to protect that. It was necessary. But try explaining that to my family. To them, I wasn't protecting my space. I was hoarding it. They couldn't understand why I wasn't willing to share what I had, as if my hard-earned stability was something up for grabs. And that disconnect only made me dig my heels in further. As the pressure from my family mounted, I couldn't help but ask myself, why me? Why was I being singled out as the solution to this crisis? Jason has his own family. My mom was already helping, and there are other relatives who could step in. Yet, somehow, all eyes were on me, like I was the only one who could take this on. Jason's extended family wasn't small. He had cousins, siblings, and even his parents, who were retired and had far more time and resources than I did. But instead of turning to them, everyone seemed focused on my house, as if having a few extra rooms made me the default choice. I tried suggesting alternatives. I asked my mom why the family couldn't come together and create a schedule where everyone pitched in. If the kids rotated between relatives, it wouldn't fall so heavily on one person. She dismissed it immediately. "Kids need stability, Anna," she said. "They need one place to call home." I even brought up Jason's side of the family. "Why aren't his parents stepping up?" I asked. "They live in a big house and they're retired. They have the time and the space." My mom brushed it off, saying, "It's complicated," without offering any real explanation. It felt like every suggestion I made was met with a roadblock. The only solution anyone seemed interested in was me. And the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. There were plenty of people who could step in and help, not just with temporary childcare, but with real, tangible support. But no one was willing to step outside their comfort zone. Instead, they wanted to push the entire burden onto me because it was easier than finding a better solution. It was like everyone had decided that because I didn't have kids, I had nothing better to do. They weren't looking for the best option. They were looking for the easiest one. And I was done being the family's go-to backup plan. By this point, the situation wasn't just frustrating. It was emotionally draining. Every conversation with my family left me feeling more isolated, more misunderstood. It wasn't just about the practicalities anymore. It was about the way they made me feel like I was failing everyone by standing my ground. The accusations cut deep, being called selfish, ungrateful, or heartless, especially by people who were supposed to know me best, made me question everything. Was I being cold? Was I letting my pride get in the way of helping my family? Every time someone brought up the kids, I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it was almost physical. But then the anger would creep in. Why wasn't Lisa being held accountable? Why was my family more focused on guilting me than demanding answers from her? She was the one who abandoned her kids, yet I was the one being vilified. It felt like I was being punished simply for trying to live my own life. I started avoiding calls and messages just to give myself a break from the constant barrage of opinions. But the silence wasn't any better. Left alone with my thoughts, I couldn't escape the weight of it all. The kids deserved better than this chaos, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd be sacrificing myself if I gave in. Every decision felt wrong. Saying no made me feel heartless, but saying yes felt impossible. I was stuck in a limbo where no outcome would leave me feeling at peace. And the longer it dragged on, the more exhausted I became. Emotionally, mentally, and even physically. It wasn't just about the kids or my family anymore. It was about whether I could even hold myself together under the pressure. And honestly, I wasn't sure I could. As the days passed and the family drama intensified, I couldn't stop thinking about Lisa. How had we gotten here? How had she managed to wreak so much havoc and yet face none of the consequences? Lisa has always been this way. Growing up, she was charming, carefree, and utterly oblivious to the messes she left behind. My parents adored her, and their constant defense of her actions only fueled her sense of invincibility. "Lisa just needs a little more time," they'd say. "Lisa's going through a phase." Those phases always seemed to last until someone else cleaned up the fallout. But this wasn't a school project she forgot to finish or a relationship she left in shambles. These were her children, 3 little humans who relied on her, who deserved better than to be abandoned without warning. And yet, Lisa had somehow convinced herself that walking away was justified. The Instagram posts were the final straw. Seeing her lounging on beaches and sipping cocktails while the rest of us dealt with the chaos was a slap in the face. She wasn't just avoiding her responsibilities. She was flaunting her freedom, as if to say, "Look what I can do while you all scramble to fix things." What baffled me even more was the family's refusal to confront her. No one was calling her out or demanding that she come back. Instead, they directed all their energy toward me, as if my refusal to step in was the real problem. Lisa had always been able to shift the blame onto someone else, and this time was no different. The family saw her as fragile, someone who needed to be handled with care. But the reality was that Lisa wasn't fragile. She was selfish. And while everyone else seemed content to let her off the hook, I wasn't. I couldn't fix Lisa, and I certainly couldn't fix the life she'd walked away from. What I could do was hold my ground and refuse to let her choices ruin the life I'd worked so hard to build. But standing firm came at a cost, and that cost was starting to feel unbearable. Amid all the chaos, I started to realize that this situation wasn't just about Lisa or my family. It was about me. For years, I'd been the reliable one, the responsible one, the person everyone could count on to step in when things went wrong. And honestly, I had let myself fall into that role. I thought being dependable was something to be proud of, and maybe it is. But somewhere along the way, I stopped setting boundaries. This time, though, something was different. I didn't want to keep sacrificing myself for the sake of family. I'd worked too hard to get to where I was, and I finally understood that protecting my own peace wasn't selfish. It was necessary. But learning that lesson didn't make it any easier. The guilt was constant, an ache I couldn't shake. I kept thinking about the kids and wondering if I was letting them down. But then I'd think about what saying yes would mean for me. It wasn't just about giving them a place to stay. It was about completely altering my life in a way I wasn't ready for. Through all of this, I realized something else. My family wasn't just asking me to help. They were asking me to become someone I wasn't ready to be. I wasn't their mother, and I couldn't replace Lisa, no matter how much they wanted me to. What I learned was that it's okay to say no. It's okay to recognize your limits and protect what you've worked for. It doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. For the first time, I felt a sense of clarity. I wasn't responsible for fixing Lisa's mess. And while that didn't erase the guilt, it gave me the strength to keep saying no, even when it felt impossible. At one point, when the weight of the family's judgment became too much, I wondered what other people would think if they knew the full story. Would strangers see me as selfish too? Or would they understand my side in a way my own family couldn't? I thought about how stories like this often end up online. On forums like Reddit's "Am I the Asshole?" I imagined typing out my situation and sharing every messy detail. Lisa's abandonment, the Instagram posts, my family's relentless guilt-tripping, and my own internal struggle. What would the verdict be? On one hand, I could see how people might call me out. They're just kids, some would say. How could you turn your back on them? Others might argue that family comes first, no matter how hard it is. I braced myself for the imaginary judgment, the inevitable flood of YTA, "You're the asshole," comments. But then I thought about the other side of the internet, the people who would see through the guilt-tripping and recognize the impossible position I was in. They'd point out that I wasn't the one who walked away from my responsibilities. "Lisa is the real problem here," they'd write. "She abandoned her kids, and now everyone is dumping that burden onto you." NTA. I wondered if those imaginary strangers would give me the validation I craved, but couldn't get from my own family. Maybe they'd remind me that it's okay to have boundaries, that saying no doesn't make me heartless. Or maybe they'd call me out, and I'd finally see things from a perspective I hadn't considered. But no matter what the internet might say, the reality wouldn't change. I'd still have to face my family's judgment and carry the guilt of my decision. Even if the world sided with me, it wouldn't erase the ache of knowing those kids were caught in the middle. At the end of the day, I wasn't looking for a verdict. I was looking for peace. And that was something no one else could give me. As I kept replaying the situation in my head, I realized that this wasn't just about who was right or wrong. It wasn't even about the kids, Lisa, or the family drama. At its core, this was about something much bigger. The idea of responsibility and how it gets passed around in families like mine. For my family, Lisa's failures had always been seen as someone else's responsibility to fix. When she messed up in school, I was told to help her study. When she made poor life choices, my parents swooped in to cushion the blow. And now, When she abandoned her kids, the family expected me to step in. It was as if Lisa had been trained to walk away from consequences because she knew someone else would always pick up the pieces. But this time, I couldn't do it. I wouldn't. Not because I didn't care about my niece and nephews. I did, deeply. But because I couldn't allow myself to become another enabler in Lisa's endless cycle of irresponsibility. This wasn't just about protecting my life or my boundaries. It was about sending a message, even if no one else wanted to hear it. Lisa had to face the reality of what she'd done. And while I didn't have the power to force her to come back or take responsibility, I did have the power to say, "Not this time." Of course, the family didn't see it that way. To them, this was black and white. Either I stepped up, or I didn't care about the kids. But for me, it was more complicated. This wasn't about choosing between my life and theirs. It was about breaking a pattern that had gone on far too long. And for once, I was choosing me. As the dust began to settle, or at least as much as it could, I found myself reevaluating my entire view of family. For years, I'd accepted certain dynamics without question. Lisa was the golden child. I was the responsible one, and my role was to pick up the slack. It was an unspoken rule that no one dared to challenge. But now, in the middle of this mess, I couldn't ignore how unhealthy those dynamics really were. Family is supposed to be about love, support, and mutual respect. Yet in my case, it often felt like family meant sacrifice. My sacrifice. Lisa made mistakes, and I was expected to shoulder the burden. My accomplishments were brushed aside, and my boundaries were ignored, all in the name of helping the family. For the first time, I started to question whether those expectations were fair or even necessary. Why was it my responsibility to fix what Lisa broke? Why did my family value Lisa's comfort over my well-being? And why was standing up for myself considered selfish, but abandoning your own kids wasn't? It was a hard truth to swallow, but I realized that family isn't just about blood, it's about respect. And if my family couldn't respect my boundaries or my right to live my own life, then maybe their opinion didn't carry as much weight as I thought it did. This shift in perspective didn't make the situation any less painful. I still felt guilty, and I still worried about the kids. But it gave me a new sense of clarity. I wasn't rejecting my family. I was rejecting the toxic patterns that had defined our relationships for so long. I loved my family, but love didn't mean I had to lose myself. It didn't mean sacrificing my peace or my future to clean up someone else's mess. And for the first time, I felt like I could choose a different path, one where I put myself first, even if it meant standing alone. After everything, I'm left with one lingering question. Did I do the right thing? It's not a question I expect to ever answer fully. Every decision I made felt like it came with a price. My peace of mind, my relationships with my family, and most painfully, the uncertainty of what this means for my niece and nephews. The guilt hasn't gone away. I still think about the kids constantly. I wonder if they're okay, if they've started to understand what's happening, or if they're still asking why their mom isn't there. I wish I could do more for them, but I also know that stepping in wouldn't solve the deeper issues. What they need isn't just a house to stay in. They need their mother to take responsibility, to show up for them in a way she hasn't. My family? Things are strained, to say the least. My mom barely speaks to me now, except to make the occasional passive-aggressive comment about how family sticks together. Some relatives have stopped reaching out altogether, clearly choosing Lisa's side in the unspoken divide. Others still offer their quiet support, but even they seem hesitant to get too involved. But despite the guilt, the fallout, and the lingering doubts, I can't bring myself to regret my decision. I worked too hard for my stability, my independence, and my sense of self to throw it all away. Taking in Lisa's kids might have earned me temporary approval from my family, but it would have come at a cost I wasn't willing to pay. So, where does that leave me? Still figuring things out, I suppose. I love my family, and I love those kids, but I've learned that love doesn't mean losing yourself. I've learned that it's okay to set boundaries, even when it's hard, even when it means people you care about don't understand. Am I the asshole? Maybe, but at the end of the day, I can only do what feels right for me, and right now, That means protecting the life I've worked so hard to build, even if it means walking away.